Hi all, if we could just start coming back. I hope you had a nice little break. So our next session is categories and representations. I'm very excited about this. So we have Aleesa Alexander. I'm going to look up her. So who is assistant curator of American art and co-director of the Asian American Art Initiative at the Cantor Art Center at Stanford. And we have Siddhartha Shah, who is Director of Education and Civic Engagement and Curator of South Asian Art at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. In his dual roles, Shah aims to create a stronger alignment between the curatorial and education departments while broadening the reach of the museum's programs beyond its walls. Moderating will be Janet Oh, who is the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and Programs here at the Asian Art Museum. So with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks to the Asian Art Museum and the organizers of the symposium for inviting me, and also to Janet and Aleesa for our time together today. My most formative adult years were in this city, and I'm overjoyed to be back home for such an important series of talks and conversations. I'm going to get a bit personal in a bit, but I'm going to start first with a bit about my work and a few slides. So I work at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. It's the oldest continually running museum in the United States, established in 1799 as the East India Marine Society. And the way the museum formed was there were mariners and merchants from Salem who, after American independence, were free to engage in direct trade with the rest of the world. And so to be a member of the society, you had to have traveled around the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn, and brought back an object to donate to the collection. So some of the earliest objects we have are, in fact, from India. And over the years, it has grown from this original building you see here, East India Marine Hall, to a vibrant and sprawling museum that also includes 26 historic properties. And if you have not been, I encourage you to come, because as I was just speaking to Aleesa, it's quite a wild museum. So besides the 18th and 19th century objects from India that we have, we're also known for the transformational gift of the Chester and Davida Hurwitz collection of art from post-independence India. It is the largest and most important collection of modern Indian art outside the subcontinent. And my first task as curator was to mine the collections and reinstall two South Asian galleries, which had not been on view for a number of years, one of historic material and the other from the Hurwitz collection. And I wanted to bring these two adjacent galleries in conversation with each other. India and Indians as outsiders viewed them during the subcontinent's lengthy period of British occupation, and India and Indians as they viewed themselves as an independent nation and people. But the historic gallery opens with a simple question. What do you think of when you think of India? And on tours, people say all kinds of things like colors, smells, noise, yoga. But what follows in this space are many of the colonial era tropes that persist today, exemplified by comments like, "Oh, I'd love to go to India, but I just don't think I could handle the poverty." A statement that somehow denies the painful realities of poverty in this country to place them elsewhere, and that perpetuates unfortunately common and reductive ideas of India as a land of the poor and diseased. Like these objects here, a collection of papier-mâché heads created to display different turban types in colonial exhibitions, but when you look very closely, a number of them bear the marks of smallpox. The gallery is uncomfortable and somewhat claustrophobic by design and intention. Nothing is centered, everything is slightly skewed, and works are simultaneously beautiful and incredibly problematic. Objects here project the 19th century predilection for observation and classification of Indian people, much in the way that they classified plants and flowers, animals and insects at the time. Like The People of India, an 8-volume series commissioned by the British government that reduced the vast diversity of South Asian people to studio shots of picturesque natives, classified by name when that was known, occupation, religion, and location. But most striking about these types or categories is that they appear in a range of mediums. We have several hundred paintings on mica of different occupations: the block printer, basket weaver, or my favorite, a Hindu maniac. Our phenomenal collection of unfired clay sculptures features different Indian types, also labeled and cataloged according to occupations: beggar, goldsmith, snake charmer, or this fellow here, my favorite, a life-size clay figure of a Hindu devotee who arrived in Salem nearly 200 years ago, was originally classified as a palki bearer. But in working with this material, I started to ask myself, of all the ways that Indian people could be classified, why were occupations the way to go? And I had a sudden realization that Indians are still aligned with the jobs they do, even today. There's a general lack of surprise when I say that my father and my brother are physicians. I do have a cousin who owns a corner shop. I have relatives who own Patel motels. And yes, I have a cousin who works at Google, in IT, and a number of them who are engineers. But what I want to touch on here is my own complicated relationship with my own occupation, being a South Asian American who works with South Asian art, a South Asianist. I recall when a professor asked a fellow graduate student of the Indian diaspora what she was studying. And when she said Indian art, he replied, "Oh, how original," even though he is a white South African man who specialized in Dutch art, which, when you think about it, really isn't all that different. Even though my first job was selling works by Keith Haring and Andy Warhol, and I was 35 years old before I took my first class in Indian art, I have felt more boxed in by this South Asian label than ever before. Somehow, I didn't consider how I, a fairly complex and complicated person, would feel when I was suddenly labeled professionally by my ethnicity. There's a tension here between my desire to learn about and share my culture of origin and a resistance to feeling like I am more South Asian and just South Asian in people's eyes now than when I worked in other fields. There's a conflict between my desire to represent and a resistance to being a representation or a type. So shortly after becoming a curator of South Asian art, I began to resist that my voice and my creativity might only be relevant to South Asian art, when, as I've said many times over the past few years, I am not a one-trick pony. I don't necessarily want for my voice only to have value when it relates to South Asia and South Asian art. I began to develop a new personal and professional goal, that one day my ethnicity would no longer be a part of my job title, or, as it is today, that it would not be my only professional label. So I'm grateful to work at a museum where, even in my first interview, I was told that PEM is not a place where people would say, "Well, you don't know anything about that," or "That's not your area of expertise." And I made it clear to our director in a brutally honest conversation that being a curator of South Asian art was likely not going to be enough for me for very long. So I welcomed the opportunity when I assumed a second role as the Director of Education and Civic Engagement. And I'm thrilled to have an opportunity to curate my first ever exhibition of non-South Asian art next year, a meditation on loss and conscious mourning by the Canadian artist Zachary Logan. Now, by sharing this, I do not mean to be critical in any way of those of us who are Asian, whose work or passions also focus on Asia. I am one of you, but I have questions that sometimes trouble me. How do Asianists grow knowledge and awareness of our art and cultures while pushing back against ideas that that is all of who we are, or that's all that we do? How do we remain specialists in areas that intersect with our personal identities while asserting that our voices and experiences matter far beyond a specific region? How do we highlight our areas without perpetuating a kind of isolation and segregation of our identities from larger conversations about art, culture, and identity? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Like probably everyone else here, this is my first time doing this in person again, so I really welcome this opportunity to be on this panel, which feels very personal and relevant, and I'm so happy that Padma invited me to participate. I remember 3 years ago when Padma was first talking about this project, or even before that, and all the things that have happened since then, and in ways both troubling but also hopeful, how this project is even more relevant now than it probably was then in its first genesis. So I'm happy to be here at the Asian Art Museum, which has always been such a wonderful institution and ally to the Cantor, and especially to the Asian American Art Initiative, which I'll speak about in more depth, and the projects that we are working on to that end. I will also say, since Siddhartha and I are getting personal today, that if you would have told me when I was an undergraduate who did not learn about the work of a single Asian American artist, that the art world that I would enter would be very Asian, that I would have not believed you. And today, living in the Bay Area and working with the great Asian diaspora and different Asian communities has been rewarding and unexpected and challenging and personally fulfilling in ways that I did not anticipate. And this was also not necessarily the career trajectory I had planned for myself when I started graduate school, and I will speak about that a little more at the end. So, I have been thinking about this quote for a long time, for the past couple of years, by the great Asian American studies scholar Margot Machida, where she writes in 1990, "At present, no museum-scale setting is exclusively devoted to reflecting the richness and diversity of contemporary visual arts emanating from our numerous Asian national communities and generational groups, each with separate traditions, beliefs, and immigrant histories. The development of such institutions would correspond to those alternative spaces and museums that have been so successful in promoting other American ethnic and racial groups." So here, Machida is talking about how there is no space in 1990 exclusively devoted to the collection and display of contemporary Asian American art, and she's thinking about places like the Studio Museum in Harlem and what that institution has done for Black history and American history in recognizing the contributions of Black Americans to the American canon. And this still remains true, although I will add, in a historical sense, there is no place exclusively devoted to the exhibition and display and collection of Asian American art from the historical to the contemporary, which is a little crazy when you begin to think about it. And at the Cantor, all of my information went away, okay. There was text there, and now there is no longer. For those of you who haven't been, we're about 35 miles south, but Stanford is its own world in a sense, though we're trying to change that. We are what we still uncomfortably call an encyclopedic museum, in that we aim, or at least attest to depicting or representing as much as possible artistic production across time and space from all regions and chronologies, although of course our collection is limited to the 40,000 objects that we currently have. Our initial collection of course, came from the Stanfords. The museum was built in honor of Leland Stanford Jr., who passed away at the age of 15. So I'm trying to think about and work through what Machida is asking for in the context of a so-called encyclopedic museum and what we can do and what is possible in those types of spaces, while also working through all of the transitions museums are going through today, rightfully so, with regard to repatriation, decolonization, DEAI initiatives, and the like. And we at the Cantor are also in a moment of transition in finding new leadership. So there's a lot going on, in the global and local perspective in my life. So in thinking about Asian American art at the Cantor, this initiative, I came on board with Professor Marcy Kwan, who had been working on Asian American art history before I got to the Cantor in 2018. And when I joined, I knew that an essential part of my job would be to help spearhead this initiative, which seeks to make Stanford and the Cantor the premier center of study for Asian American art. And when I got there at the Cantor, there were around 70 objects in the collection that were related to Asian American art. And now, today, there are close to 300, which, in the museum world is still very minor, but we're getting somewhere. And this is just a selection of some of the works that we have brought into the collection since then. In order to start an initiative, especially an initiative with any sort of longevity, you have to have the actual material to work with. So this is something that we as curators have to work through, in the sense that to collect and to hoard is itself a kind of colonialist mentality, and yet in order to build this history, I do have to have that raw material to work with and present. And so how to reconcile acknowledging that impulse, but also trying to repair and create a kind of historical reparation within the museum space. All of the images you are looking at are gifts to our collection. Because of COVID, our acquisition funds were frozen, so everything that I had acquired in the last year towards the AAAI was a gift, and in fact there are people in this room who have given to our collection, and it's been such a tremendous community endeavor, and one that I firmly believe does need to happen in the Bay Area because of our long history with regard to the Asian diaspora. So I think museum maps are fun to look at because they tell you a lot about museums, and they really show off a certain kind of arbitrariness with regard to collecting, with regard to the way knowledge is organized and presented. You know, we say that we're encyclopedic, but all museums are very much driven by the things that they have in their collection. And so when you think about that, it cannot ever really be representative or accurate because you only have so much material to work with. So of course, you know, we have African art next to Rodin. I mean, how much sense does that really make? But we have a lot of Rodin. So we have to show that off. So I like to think about these kind of real nuts and bolts issues of thinking through what it means to do this type of work in an actual physical space, in a museum that is a university museum that is devoted to the community at large and the students, and how do we create knowledge in a way that is meaningful, that isn't just an addendum to the canon, right? Something that is just there to kind of supplement or fix. And here's the second floor. And, you know, I'm also thinking about the history of Stanford itself and the fact that the campus was built in large part by Chinese laborers who were housed on Stanford's campus, and that is being part of the inheritance of the building that I walk through every week and the land that we walk on, and all the trees on Palm Drive were planted by Chinese laborers. And to think about the debt that we owe at that institution to help represent that history as much as possible. On the right are pot shards and glass shards from the archaeological digs that have been done on campus to excavate the housing of such Chinese laborers. So I ask myself, and I have yet to fully come around a complete and succinct answer to what it would mean to dedicate a permanent gallery space to Asian American art in that layout that I just showed you, in that floor map of that museum and the institution. And does it seem arbitrary, as it does to some people, to have a space created only by ethnic identity, and even really not then, because Asian American is a broad umbrella term that incorporates a lot of different ethnic groups. And so here, we're just looking at an imaginary SketchUp layout of what that might look like. And of course, there are always pros and cons to thinking about doing something like this. You know, you think to yourself, well, maybe it would be more effective to just fold this work into the American galleries, to insert it into the pre-existing narratives, which I do sometimes. And that is maybe the way to effect greatest change, because why would you want to necessarily isolate artists like this based, you know, solely on something like ethnicity? And yet, this is the initiative that I run, and this is the work that we are currently really collecting at the museum. On a personal note, and you know, this is something that I think about a lot, and similar to the way that Siddhartha works through a lot of these issues himself, I never had access to a space ever in a museum, or I had never set foot in a museum and in a gallery where all of the work that was created in there was part of larger intersecting complex histories of the Asian diaspora. And I think to myself what it would be like to encounter any of these works, which are made by Asian American artists, and all of them are in our collection. I think about what that would have meant for myself as a young scholar, studying American art and American history, because for myself, it is really hard to imagine something if you can't see it. And that's just a kind of flaw that I have. If I can't see something, sometimes it's really hard to imagine it. So what would it mean to just be able to have those types of encounters, and how would that have changed me as a scholar, throughout time? So in that sense, I would like to be able to at least provide that type of opportunity, especially in a university art museum space, a place like Stanford where the student population is very Asian American, to be able to provide those types of experiences and engage in these types of dialogues. And we have not yet set out a plan, a specific concrete plan for doing so at the Cantor. It is still in discussion. We are still talking through what that would mean, where that would go, how it would be done, but it is a question that is on all of our minds at the moment. But I can plug just a few things that will be coming up next year with regard to Asian American art, because, the way that I think about it is, what if museums not just, were beholden to the things that they inherited, but also with their collections could demonstrate what they care about and what they believe in and what they hope for in the future and how things might be able to change, and that making acquisitions is actually an important way of demonstrating that, because you are committing to the forever care of objects and stories that were previously not represented in the museum. So we will be installing Ruth Asawa's Wall of Masks in July of next year. Ruth Asawa made hundreds of masks, ceramic masks of her friends and family members and community members, and hung this on the exterior of her home for 40 years. And so the Cantor acquired 233 of those masks, and we will be placing them in a very central part of our museum as a way of talking about the importance of community and collectivity here in the Bay Area, and what one person like Ruth Asawa can do. We will also be installing a couple of exhibitions, also collection space. My colleague Maggie, who's also here, will be doing a show called At Home on Stage, Asian American Representation in Photography and Film. And finally, I don't know what happened to my PowerPoint. The final show, which I will tell you the title is East of the Pacific, Making Histories of Asian American Art, is a very large exhibition of a lot of these recent acquisitions towards the Asian American Art Initiative. And actually the title East of the Pacific came from something that the director Jay here said during a AAAI event. So it's really kind of community-oriented, community-generated exhibition, and it's a historical survey from the late 19th century to the present of key moments in Asian American art. So these are the small steps, the small, Usha talked about this, small, slow steps and change and revolutions, the things that we can kind of focus on and move towards, and thinking about the kind of long game. And I think when you work in a museum, you have to think about the long game, because we work so slow that it's not usually very immediate in the things that we're able to do. And finally, I just wanted to touch on what I actually did study as a graduate student. I received my PhD in 2018 from UC Santa Barbara, and I worked primarily on contemporary Southern African American artists who were what we would call self-taught. And I worked on this exhibition at the Met when I was finishing my dissertation, which was based off of a recent gift of work from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. The DeYoung has a great collection of this work as well. And I, of course I was drawn to this material because I felt like this was a very important American story that was not properly acknowledged in museums, especially, artists who had day jobs, artists who were not what they would even themselves call artists. Making incredible work that speaks to history, that speaks to community, speaks to culture. I also, like Siddhartha, did not want to be the Asian American person working on an Asian American topic in graduate school. I was worried about that. I think that we are sometimes, as an Asian American, you also internalize this idea of not wanting to stand out because of that is something that we don't need to kind of talk about. And also, you know, my own positionality as someone who has a white father and a Thai mother, who am I to even be able to take that claim as Asian American, because maybe I'm not even Asian enough. Granted, my identity, of course, came into play when I was working on my dissertation research, and I think, you know, for any non-white curator or scholar, our identity is always a question of why do you care about what you care about, and that is something that we always have to confront. But being able to come back around and work on the Asian American Art Initiative is a way, at least for myself, to say that thinking about this material, investing in this material, in communities that are not necessarily my own, but I consider them, you know, great elders and ancestors who belong to them, it is a way of coming back around and owning that this material is important and that it is okay to kind of claim it and to want to help it. So this is where we're at today, and look forward to chatting with Siddhartha more about this.
Thank you so much, Aleesa and Siddhartha. I think there was something very poetic how we moved from the idea of a recently finished gallery to an unfinished gallery. It really speaks to a lot of the unanswered questions that we have in museums as we stand in a museum. I guess my first question is, you mentioned isolation and segregation of identities. I was wondering if either of you have a proposal for, or just ideas of how we can extricate ourselves from these frameworks of identity. It's a heavy one.
Well, that's one of those, it's like a koan, like, you know, like an unanswerable question. I think I was thinking about this morning, actually, about Indian identity or like gay identity, and then thinking like, do I have more in common with some other homosexual, or do I have more in common with a Gemini? Or do I have, you know, and I think it really, I don't know how to answer that. And I think that museums have convinced us that the way that we divide the world is based on region. But just as I say that, it's obviously so problematic. But I don't know what we have to unlearn and the layers we have to unlearn to think more broadly.
Yeah, I think in the way that I've been thinking through that question and what some may call the arbitrariness of the term Asian American itself is that when it comes to presenting the works or thinking through the works, that specificity really matters, because in the end, we all want to be regarded as individuals with important stories that are unique to our lives. They may have commonalities with others and greater historical struggles, but to the extent that we can tease out those individual stories with the didactic material, with whatever way that we choose to present this work, is the way that I like to think about it, and the way that you get away from generalization, because no one likes generalization. I mean, we're trained as historians to kind of do that, to kind of do a sweep and make some kind of statement about a time or a people or a place. And to the extent that we can balance that with also acknowledging and honoring an individual story of an artist, is the way that I've been thinking through it these days.
Yeah, at the Asian Art Museum, we are thinking about shedding more light on Asian American artists. Like when you were talking about never having studied an Asian American artist earlier, it occurred to me that it was the same. And there is a bigger story to tell, and it's about the details and giving people the space as individuals. I guess my second question is, we discussed privately before this, we're talking about also inter-ethnic and intergenerational community. So going beyond representation or categories of nationality, how do you think we can foster more inter-ethnic and intergenerational community through our work?
Isn't that your other job, your second job, Siddhartha?
It is my second job. And I have to say, so I'll just use where I work as an example. We're in Salem, Massachusetts, where there's a very large Dominican community and Caribbean communities that are there. And we do not have a very large Caribbean collection. We do not have much work out there. But learning that Usha Iyer is working on something about like India, or Indian film and the Caribbean, I think is exactly the kind of thing that we need to start creating some of those conversations. In my case, I think we have to start with what we have, as you were saying, like a museum is somehow kind of restricted by what it has. So we start with what we have, which is a large South Asian collection, and find those connections with different communities, and make those conversations open and accessible and delivered in a way that is palatable and meaningful to the communities that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, you know, the Asian American Art Initiative was not publicly announced until January of this year, but we had been working behind the scenes on this project for the last couple of years. And I've been finding, at least in my curatorial practice, that the most rewarding thing is working with the community that's already here and acknowledging all the amazing work that has already been done in the Bay Area with regard to Asian American art and history. This is really the place where a lot of the work has been done, and a lot of my practice now is really thinking about how to decenter that authoritative curatorial voice, which is so what we're taught to do throughout graduate school and even in museums, that this is the way that we make an impact or stake our claim. And I have learned so much through working with all of the people who have reached out to me personally through the announcement of the AAAI. It has been really amazing and heartwarming to see the response. And so I find myself, and this is just on a small micro scale of my own experience, I find myself doing a lot of listening and making a lot of connections that are based on knowing people in the community and looking to what others have done first instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, which is so often what museums seek to do. They want to reinvent the wheel, and it's like, why don't you just take a look at the amazing things that have been done and try to honor and build on that. And that is so often done by previous generations, other communities. And as long as you are respectful and find ways to gain trust and work together, then I think so much more can be accomplished with a kind of decentering.
On the note of that, how can we, because we have such an amazing community of Asian and Asian American artists, maybe this is a little more specific to the Bay Area, how can we ensure that work by Asian American artists can even go into a collection or a museum?
Well, thankfully, the museum world and those who are represented in curatorial roles and on museum staff is slowly shifting than what it once was, although so much more work needs to be done in that regard. And so I don't have a great answer to that because museums are hierarchical, and the way that something enters a collection, it actually can be the decision of one person, and also one person can veto it, one person can okay it, and if they happen to think that that work is not valuable or worth preserving, then that's a no-go. So you do have to change the hierarchies, and if the work also, you know, artworks are inextricably connected with money, and so the relationship between that artwork and money streams and whether or not it is considered valuable in that regard is also a problem. So I don't have a great answer for that. Maybe you have a better answer, Siddhartha.
No, I do not have a better answer, but what does come to mind is something that I've recently claimed as a tool or a weapon, which is simply to ask the question, what do you mean by that? And what comes to mind is there is a South Asian artist who spent most of their life, decades in the United States, and when an archive was offered to the, was it the Archive of American Artists? Is that what it is?
Archive of America, the Smithsonian? Or?
Yeah, I think, yeah. The response was that that they were too Indian, or that I did not get this response, but I was told this by the person who was working, that their work was too Indian or they were too Indian. And that's an opportunity to say, well, what do you mean by that? And get them to really think about why they're making that decision, and not only think about it, but to actually say it out loud. Why do you think this is too Indian? I need to hear you explain this to me. And that is, I think, a subtle way in which we can put the pressure on, but also start understanding what we're up against.
Yeah, I've heard that type of thing too, and I've heard it from people who've been working in this field for a long time. The amazing Mark Johnson, one of the preeminent scholars of Asian American art, he was telling me that when he wanted to put on his exhibition Asian American Modern, Shifting Currents, that was at the De Young, I think in 2008, that he had a tremendously hard time convincing venues to take the show because it was either too Asian and they didn't quite understand like where to place it. Again, like thinking how silly categories and representation, and an American museum didn't necessarily want it because it seemed too Asian, and yet it wasn't Asian enough for like an Asian art museum. And so this is, these very categories have really limited and actually shaped the reception in the field and like what has been able to be done. So it's interesting to hear that you're still encountering that kind of response these days.
It's going to take a lot of work,
Yeah.
and it's going to take time. But we're here,
Yeah.
and we're smiling, and we're ready to do the work.
Exactly. Well, that's a great question. I will keep that in mind for my future work. I do want to give people a chance to visit our galleries. So I think we will close here for this session. And I wanted to thank you again, Aleesa and Siddhartha, for your thoughts and your presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.